Dalia Mogahed, am I pronouncing it? Is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Ms. Mogahed, am I pronouncing it right?
Yes.
Oh, good. Is the former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslims communities worldwide. President Barack Obama appointed her to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. She is also the CEO of the Mogahed Consulting. Thank you very much for being with us, and we're all ears.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. Islamophobia, defined as anti-Muslim bigotry or discrimination, has reached unprecedented levels in American political discourse and policy. Muslims are the least warmly regarded group in America. Political leaders, primarily in the GOP, receive standing ovations and points in the polls for suggesting that Muslims be banned from the United States, that a Muslim cannot be president of the United States, and that Islam is a cancer to be removed from America, among other statements. Now, while clearly a danger to Muslims, my testimony seeks to argue that Islamophobia is a threat to every American and should be addressed as a national priority. First, Islamophobia makes us less free. It is driven by fear, and from a neurological perspective, fear makes us more accepting of authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. Three things that are corrosive to our freedom. Second, anti-Muslim legislation overlaps with legislation that curtails the rights of other minority groups. Specifically, we found an 80% overlap between anti-Sharia legislation and legislation that takes away the rights of African American and Latinos to vote, the rights of women, the rights of the gay community, and the ability for workers to organize. One more is immigrant rights. So anti-Muslim legislation and legislation that takes away the rights of other groups are connected by 80% of the legislators that propose them. But Islamophobia also makes us less safe. It incites anti-Muslim attacks, and there's a sharp rise in hate crimes over the past several years. The second thing is it feeds the ISIS narrative. According to a Pentagon press secretary, Peter Cook, anything that tries to bolster the ISIL narrative that the United States is somehow at war with Islam is contrary to our values and contrary to our national security. We actually have seen actual propaganda videos that use clips from Donald Trump's statements in them. It feeds the narrative of and the actions of white supremacy hate groups that target Americans of color. According to experts at the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center, who monitor hate groups and anti-Muslim sentiment, Trump's call to halt the entrance of Muslims to the United States drove online chatter among white supremacists and is likely to inspire violence against Muslims. In fact, another study found that there was a link between these statements in December and actual hate crimes. So, what should we do about it? And I recommend the following. We should continue to reinforce guidelines from the Department of Education to schools and universities to address bullying and discrimination. I just came back from a conference where a young man, he couldn't have been older than 12, raised his hand and said, "I am being socially oppressed at school." The fact that he even had this language was heartbreaking. And then he went on to describe the daily harassment and bullying that he was facing, being called a terrorist on a daily basis, being accused of having bombs, and he had no idea what to do. And this story is something I hear everywhere. 50% of Muslim students say that they face some level of bullying, and 20% of the time it's actually from the teacher. We also have to reevaluate federal law enforcement strategies and FBI programs and how they impact the Muslim community. We can no longer securitize our relationship with the Muslim community or criminalize a community. Things like invasive law enforcement, including surveillance and the overuse of informants, alienates the community while casting them as suspects to their fellow citizens, reinforcing stereotypes and bigotry. We should also implement a national strategy to combat white supremacist violent extremism. As UNC Professor Charles Kurtzman and Duke Professor David Schnasner explained last June in the New York Times, Islam-inspired terror attacks accounted for 50 fatalities over the past 13 years and a half. Meanwhile, right-wing extremists averaged 337 attacks and were responsible for 254 fatalities. Despite these realities, we lack a comprehensive strategy and infrastructure to combat the growing threat of white supremacy ideology. This deficit endangers the American Muslim community as well as all Americans of color who have been victims of bigotry-motivated violence, from arson attacks to lethal shootings. And finally, we must apply a consistent definition and public treatment of terrorism across violent incidents. While defining terrorism is tricky and riddled with complexity, a consistent application of an objective standard is badly needed to re-educate the public, which only hears the term applied to Muslims, despite the facts. Treat Muslim terrorists like Christian terrorists, as deviating from their faith rather than adhering to it extremely. Muslim terrorists are not extreme, they are simply deviant. Apply equal publicity to terrorist attacks, regardless of ideology. Though Muslim terrorism is a fraction of all terrorism in America, it receives the vast majority of public attention, reinforcing stereotypes and bigotry. Thank you.
Ms. Standen, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dalia. That was much needed and much appreciated. I just want to add a data point that may be uncomfortable for some, but is a reality, and that is that there is a deep partisan divide on this issue. A poll that we did last year found, we asked specifically the question, this is actually early this year, if a Muslim American were to attain an important position of influence in government, are you confident the person would be able to do the job, or do you feel their religion would influence their decision-making? 52%, a majority of Hillary Clinton supporters, said the Muslim could do the job. Others were unsure. There was some lack of focus there on the issue. But 75% of those who said they support Donald Trump said the Muslim could not do their job. And throughout the poll, this partisan divide comes through very, very clearly. A majority of Democrats, yes, on the Republican side, the other way. It's an issue that we need to address, and I thank you for giving the data points you did. But when Donald Trump says that a Muslim judge couldn't do the job, he's speaking for a base of support in his own party that we have to be wary of, we have to be concerned about, and we have to address.
Thank you very much for making that point. I'd like to add that when you look at anti-Muslim sentiment and when it has spiked over the past several years, I actually looked at it from right before 2001, the attacks of 9/11, to 2013. And what I found is that it spiked 3 times. Once in the run-up to the Iraq War, and then among Republicans in the 2008 and 2012 election cycle. When it did not spike was at 9/11, with the actual attacks of 9/11 and in the Boston bombing. So terrorist attacks don't correlate with a spike in Islamophobia, but election cycles and terrible and disastrous wars do. So this is a tool of public manipulation. This is not the regrettable but organic result of bad Muslims doing bad things. And I think that's a very important point to take.
That's a great point. Ms. Tandon?
Yes, thank you so much for your comments. And I really wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the national security dimensions to this and how the Islamophobia that we're seeing actually reduces our country's national security. One difference that I'm aware of, but I'd love your thoughts, is that in the United States, we actually have had less acts of terrorism, in part because heretofore we have integrated communities much better, as opposed to Europe, which has had a longer standing policy or a language of Islamophobia which really separates the Muslim community. It is precisely the integration that America has really used for, and previously was bipartisan, unfortunately is no longer, that contributed to a system in which the Muslim American community was working with law enforcement, or just wasn't creating the same level of anger that sometimes fuels these things. So I would love to just get your thoughts on how this rising rhetoric of honestly hate is making us less safe.
Thank you so much for that question. So when you look at radicalization in general across ideologies, the one common factor is alienation.
Yes.
In a recent poll, we found something very interesting. First, unsurprising to, I think, many of us, American Muslims, American Jews, American Catholics, and Protestants all are equally likely to condemn attacks on civilians. Now, we looked at what factors made people less likely, within a community. So we looked at the Muslim community. Religiosity did not make people less likely to condemn terrorism. In fact, mosque attendance correlated with more civic engagement, more investment in the process and in the system that a group like ISIS wants to destroy. The one factor that made a Muslim less likely condemn terrorism was if they had a lower identification with America. So a higher religious identity had no effect. But if they didn't identify strongly with their country of the United States, they were more likely to say it's sometimes justified to target civilians. And what that says to me is that alienating Muslims from their American identity opens up the psychological space for a group like ISIS to come in and make a case to them. What we know from all the cases we're familiar with is that people are getting radicalized in their basement and in their bedroom in front of a computer, not in a mosque. The first thing a group like ISIS will do is to alienate them from their country, from their community, and even from their family. The more this rhetoric is allowed to be normalized, the more a group like ISIS has a chance to get in there with alienated young people and make a case to them.
Dr. West.
Yes, thank you for your testimony. I think all of us ought to be committed to the notion that a Muslim life has exactly the same value as a Christian life, a Buddhist life, a Hindu life, a Jewish life, an agnostic or atheist life. That's at the normative level, though. My question is, what is the role of corporate media as it relates to U.S. foreign policy in this sense? We rarely hear reported how many people, innocent civilians, are killed when there's a U.S. invasion or occupation. We rarely hear reported how many innocent people are killed when a U.S. drone is dropped. It might hit a targeted combatant, but also hit a non-combatant. And it's that spiritual and moral dimension that I think all of us ought to be concerned about. Why is there not more massive reporting in corporate media as it relates to Muslim lives lost? Because we do get a lot of focus on the fascist versions of Islam, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth, but all of the non-fascist versions tend to be downplayed.
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. West. First, a couple of reality points. One is that Muslims are the primary targets of terrorism. More than 95% of the victims of ISIS are other Muslims, and I think that most people don't realize that. Second, when you look at corporate media, one study found that 80% of US news media covering Islam and Muslims is negative. Now that might that might not mean anything. 80% sounds like a big number, but you actually can compare it to US news media coverage of North Korea, and it's 72% negative. So you have North Korea, a designated terrorist state that has actually threatened our country, and you have a community of 1.6 billion people who are more negatively portrayed than this country. One study of the New York Times, the most elite and so-called liberal paper, found that Islam was portrayed more negatively in the New York Times than was cancer and cocaine. So when you take this all into account, and we wonder why there's Islamophobia, my only question is why there isn't more of it. And the first victims of the American people, our first casualty to this media bias is our freedom, because we are being manipulated as citizens, and our critical thinking is being dumbed down and prevented by this level, this code red, toxic media coverage and bias against an entire community.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Your testimony is so important today, and we really appreciate it. Let me ask you about children. The fear now that children feel, the bullying that is taking place. How do you think we need to address this as it relates to the schools? How do schools need to understand the fear and the trauma now that young Muslim children are feeling as a result of Islamophobia and the bullying that they're experiencing?
Thank you for that question. I just came back yesterday, actually, from a roundtable at the White House discussing this question. And I think what we need is to provide schools, especially principals and administrators, clear guidelines about what to do when there is a bullying situation. What are the consequences? What constitutes bullying? And then for that to be communicated to parents and students. The issue right now is many people literally have no idea what to do when it happens. They do often report it to the principal, and nothing gets done. There just needs to be a much more robust system that is implemented, and then people held accountable to following it. Because for young people to go to school and not feel safe, I mean, one young woman just recently told me that it was so bad that it actually caused her to acquire an anxiety syndrome, and now she suffers mental health problems because of the bullying over 2 years. So I think the guidelines and the enforcement is what really needs to be much more strongly communicated.
Hi, hello again. Thank you for your testimony and the impact on Muslims in the United States. But I think you would have thoughts about something that is current U.S. government policy, which is to spend a significant amount of money on counter-violent extremism messaging. And just to your reaction, this maybe drifts a little bit into tomorrow's program, but its effectiveness or how it could be more effective.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that.
I'll come back tomorrow.
I think that we are currently, let me take a step back. First, I think let's understand that the vast majority of Muslims in America and globally abhor ISIS. ISIS believes that we collectively are not Muslim. They regard us as outside the faith. So their primary victims are other Muslims. They are already doing counter-violent extremism messaging through their behavior. Where all of our good efforts really get eroded is in the rhetoric and statements of our political leaders. that is being used and fed into ISIS propaganda videos. We can do all the CVE counter narrative we want, but when the loudest voices are actually perpetuating the same narrative as ISIS, which is that there's a divide, and it's this enmity between Islam and the West, and it's irreconcilable, and it can only be a relationship of animosity. When that's the narrative, when the narrative is you have to choose between being an American and being a Muslim, all the CVE counter narrative that the State Department is putting out is ineffective. It's a drop in the bucket, and these other voices are much louder.
Thank you very much. Thank you.